According to the Hebrew Bible, Saul was the first king of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah. His reign, traditionally placed in the late 11th century BCE, would have marked a switch from a tribal society to statehood. The oldest accounts of Saul's life and reign are found in the Hebrew Bible. He was reluctantly anointed by the prophet Samuel in response to a popular movement to establish a monarchy, and reigned from Gibeah. After initial successes, he lost favor with Samuel and God because of his disobedience to God. His son-in-law, David, was chosen by God to be a king. He fell on his sword to avoid capture at the battle against the Philistines at Mount Gilboa. He was succeeded by his son, Ishbosheth, whose brief reign was successfully contested by David. A similar yet different account of Saul's life is given in the Quran. Neither the length of Saul's reign, nor the extent of his territory are given in the biblical account. The former is traditionally fixed at 20 or 22 years, but there is no reliable evidence for these numbers. Biblical account. The biblical accounts of Saul's life are found in the books of Samuel. The narrative is thought to be composed from various sources by a redactor, because the text contains various internal inconsistencies, to the point that his biography is often embarrassingly confusing. House of King Saul. According to the Tanakh, Saul was the son of Kish, of the family of the Matrites, and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. It appears that he came from Gibeah. Saul married Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. They had 4 sons and 2 daughters. The sons were Jonathan, Abinadab, Malchishua and Ishbosheth. Their daughters were named Merab and Michal. Saul also had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, who bore him 2 sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth. Saul offered Merab to David as a wife after his victory over Goliath, but David was not interested in the arrangement. Saul then gave his other daughter Michal in marriage to David, but when David became Saul's rival to the kingship, Saul gave Michal in marriage to Palti, son of Laish. Saul died at the Battle of Mount Gilboa, and was buried in Zelah, in the region of Benjamin. 3 of Saul's sons, Jonathan, and Abinadab, and Malchishua, died with him at Mount Gilboa. Ishbosheth became king of Israel at the age of 40, but was killed by Banner and Rechab after hearing of Abner's death. Michal was returned as a wife to David, but was not granted any children as she disgraced David later on. Ishbosheth reigned for 2 years and was killed by 2 of his own captains. Armoni and Mephibosheth were given by David along with the 5 sons of Merab to the Gibeonites, who killed them. Michal was childless. The only male descendant of Saul to survive was Mephibosheth, Jonathan's lame son, who had been 5 when his father and grandfather Saul had died in battle. In time, he came under the protection of David. Mephibosheth had a young son, Micah, who had 4 sons and descendants named until the 9th generation. Anointed as king, the prophet Samuel is judge of Israel, but his sons are dishonest and untrustworthy. The leaders of the Israelites fear that it would be disastrous if his sons follow in his footsteps as judges and request that Samuel give them a king. Samuel seems to resent this request and warns them in detail of the oppression they can expect under a monarchy. Meanwhile, Saul, a young Israelite, is commanded by his father, Kish, to go and look for their lost donkeys. Samuel is told by God that he will meet Saul from the land of Benjamin the following day and that he is to anoint him as ruler over the people of Israel. The books of Samuel give 3 differing accounts of Saul's rise to the throne. Saul is sent with a servant to look for his father's strayed donkeys. Leaving his home at Gibeah, they eventually arrive at the district of Zuph, at which point Saul suggests abandoning their search. Saul's servant tells him that they happen to be near the town of Ramah, where a famous seer is located, and suggests that they should consult him first. The seer offers hospitality to Saul and later anoints him in private. A popular movement having arisen to establish a centralized monarchy like other nations, Samuel reluctantly assembles the people at Mizpah in Benjamin to appoint a king. After having been chosen as monarch, Saul returns to his home in Gibeah, along with a number of followers. The Ammonites, led by Nahash, lay siege to Jabesh-Gilead, which is forced to surrender. Under the terms of surrender, the occupants of the city are to be forced into slavery and have their right eyes removed. Instead they send word of this to the other tribes of Israel, and the tribes west of the Jordan assemble an army under Saul. Saul leads the army to victory over the Ammonites, and the people congregate at Gilgal, where they acclaim Saul as king, and he is crowned. Saul was crowned as king in Gilgal. Saul among the prophets having been anointed by Samuel, Saul is told of signs indicating that he has been divinely appointed. The last of these is that Saul will be met by an ecstatic group of prophets leaving a high place and playing the lyre, tambourine, and flutes. Saul encounters the ecstatic prophets and joins them. Later, Saul sends men to pursue David, but when they meet this group of ecstatic prophets playing music, they become possessed by a prophetic state and join in. Saul sends more men, but they too join the prophets. Eventually Saul himself goes, and also joins the prophets. Military victories. After relieving the siege of Jabesh-Gilead, Saul conducts military campaigns against the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and the kings of Zobah, the Philistines, and the Amalekites. Rejection. According to 1 Samuel chapter 10 verse 8, Samuel had told Saul to wait for a week, after which they would meet and he would give Saul further instructions. But when a week passes without Samuel, and with the Israelites growing restless, Saul prepares for battle by offering sacrifices. Samuel arrives just as Saul is finishing sacrificing and reprimands Saul for not obeying his instructions. After the battle with the Philistines was over, the text describes Samuel as having instructed Saul to kill all the Amalekites. Having forewarned the Kenites who were living among the Amalekites to leave, Saul goes to war and defeats the Amalekites. Saul kills all the men, women, children and poor-quality livestock, but leaves alive the king and best livestock. When Samuel learns that Saul has not obeyed his instructions, he informs Saul that God has rejected him as king due to his disobedience. As Samuel turns to go, Saul seizes hold of his garments and tears offer peace. Samuel prophesies that the kingdom will likewise be torn from Saul. Samuel then kills the Amalekite king himself, 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 33, and leaves Saul for the last time. Saul and David. After Samuel tells Saul that God has rejected him as king, David, a son of Jesse, from the tribe of Judah, enters the story. From this point on, Saul's story is largely the account of his increasingly troubled relationship with David. Samuel is surreptitiously sent by God to Jesse. While offering a sacrifice in the vicinity, Samuel includes Jesse among the invited guests. Dining together, Jesse's sons are brought one by one to Samuel, each time being rejected by him. Speaking for God, running out of sons, Jesse sends for David, the youngest, who was tending sheep. When brought to Samuel, David is anointed by him in front of his other brothers. Saul is troubled by an evil spirit sent by God. He requests soothing music, and a servant recommends David the son of Jesse, who is renowned as a skillful harpist and soldier. When word of Saul's needs reached Jesse, he sends David, who had been looking after a flock. And David is appointed as Saul's armor-bearer and remains at court playing the harp as needed to calm Saul during his troubled spells. The Philistines return with an army to attack Israel, and the Philistine and Israelite forces gather on opposite sides of a valley. The Philistines' gigantic champion Goliath challenges the Israelite army to send their champion to fight with him. David is described as a young shepherd boy who happens to be delivering food to his 3 eldest brothers in the army, and he hears Goliath's challenge. David speaks mockingly of the Philistines to some soldiers. His speech is overheard and reported to Saul, who summons David and appoints David as his champion. David easily defeats Goliath with a single shot from a sling. At the end of the passage, Saul asks his general, Abner, who David is. Saul's son Jonathan becomes David's dearest friend. Jonathan recognizes David as the rightful king, and 1 Samuel chapter 18 states, Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan even gives David his military clothes, symbolizing David's position as successor to Saul. God makes David successful wherever Saul sends him. Therefore, Saul sets David in charge of the army. Upon David's return from battle, the women praise him in song. Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands, implying that David is the greater warrior. Saul fears David's growing popularity and henceforth views him as a rival to the throne. In one incident, David plays the harp for Saul, who, possessed by an evil spirit, throws a spear at him but misses twice. Saul removes David from the court by sending him into the field at the head of the army. But David becomes increasingly successful and Saul becomes increasingly resentful. Saul offers his daughter Merab to David as a wife, but David protests that he is unworthy to marry the king's daughter and Merab is married to a different man. When Saul's other daughter Michal falls in love with David, Saul offers him her hand. David initially rejects this offer also, this time claiming he is too impoverished to marry her. Saul offers to accept the unusual bride price of only 100 Philistines' foreskins, intending that David die trying to remove them. Instead, David obtains 200 foreskins and is consequently married to Michal. Now Saul actively plots against David, but without success due to Jonathan's help. Saul sends assassins in the night, but Michal helps him escape, tricking him by placing a household idol in his bed. David flees to Jonathan, who arranges a meeting with his father. While dining with Saul, Jonathan explains David's absence, saying he has been called away to his brothers. But Saul sees through the ruse and reprimands Jonathan for protecting David, warning him that his love of David will cost him the kingdom. The next day, Jonathan meets with David and tells him Saul's intent. The two friends say their goodbyes, and David flees into the countryside. Saul later marries Michal to another man. Saul is later informed by his head shepherd, Doeg the Edomite, that high priest Ahimelech assisted David, giving him the sword of Goliath, which had been kept at the temple at Nob. Doeg kills Ahimelech and 85 other priests, and Saul furthermore massacres the entire population of Nob. David had already left Nob by this point and had amassed some 400 disaffected men, including some outlaws. With these men David rescues the town of Keilah from a Philistine attack. Saul realizes he could trap David and his men by laying the city to siege. Upon receiving divine counsel, David learns that the citizens of Keilah will betray him to Saul. He flees to Ziph pursued by Saul. Saul hunts David in the vicinity of Ziph on 2 occasions. Some of the inhabitants of Ziph betray David's location to Saul, but David hears about it and flees with his men to Maon. Saul follows David, but is forced to break off pursuit when the Philistines invade. After dealing with that threat, Saul tracks David to the caves at En-Gedi. As he searches the cave, David manages to cut off a piece of Saul's robe without being discovered, yet David restrains his men from harming the king. David then leaves the cave, revealing himself to Saul, and gives a speech that persuades Saul to reconcile. On the second occasion, Saul returns to Ziph with his men. David hears of this. He slips into Saul's camp by night, and again refrains his men from killing the king. Instead he steals Saul's spear and water jug, leaving his own spear thrust into the ground by Saul's side. The next day, David reveals himself to Saul, showing the jug and spear as proof that he could have slain him. David then persuades Saul to reconcile with him. The two swear never to harm each other. After this they never see each other again. Battle of Gilboa and the death of King Saul. The Philistines make war again, and Saul leads out his army to face them at Mount Gilboa. Before the battle he goes to consult the witch of Endor. The witch, unaware of his identity, reminds him that the king has made witchcraft a capital offense, but he assures her that Saul will not harm her. She conjures the spirit of the prophet Samuel, who before his death had both anointed Saul king and prophesied that he would lose the kingdom. Samuel tells him that God will no longer hear his prayers and that the next day he will lose both the battle and his life. 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel give conflicting accounts of Saul's death. In the former, as the defeated Israelites flee, Saul asks his armor-bearer to kill him, but he refuses and so Saul falls upon his own sword. In 2 Samuel, an Amalekite tells David he found Saul leaning on his spear after the battle and delivered the coup de grace. David has the Amalekite put to death for rejoicing in the death of the anointed king. The victorious Philistines recover Saul's body as well as those of his 3 sons who also died in the battle, decapitated them and displayed him on the wall of Beth-shan. They display Saul's armor in the temple of Ashtaroth. But at night the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead retrieve the bodies for cremation and burial. Later on, David takes the bones of Saul together and of his son Jonathan and buries them in Zelah, in the tomb of his father. Biblical criticism. There are several textual or narrative issues in the text, including the aforementioned contradictory accounts of Saul's rise to kingship and his death, as well as plays on words that biblical scholars have discussed. The birth narrative of the prophet Samuel is found at 1 Samuel chapters 1 to 28. It describes how Samuel's mother Hannah requests a son from Yahweh, and dedicates the child to God at the shrine of Shiloh. The passage makes extensive play with the root elements of Saul's name, and ends with the phrase Hu Saul Yahweh. He is dedicated to Yahweh. Hannah names the resulting son Samuel, giving as her explanation, "Because from God I requested him." Samuel's name, however, can mean name of God, and the etymology and multiple references to the root of the name seems to fit Saul instead. The majority explanation for the discrepancy is that the narrative originally described the birth of Saul, and was given to Samuel in order to enhance the position of David and Samuel at the former king's expense. The Bible's tone with regard to Saul changes over the course of the narrative, especially around the passage where David appears, midway through 1 Samuel. Before, Saul is presented in positive terms, but afterward his mode of ecstatic prophecy is suddenly described as fits of madness. His errors and disobedience to Samuel's instructions are stressed and he becomes a paranoiac. This may indicate that the David story is inserted from a source loyal to the house of David. David's lament over Saul in 2 Samuel chapter 1 then serves an apologetic purpose, clearing David of the blame for Saul's death. In the books of Samuel, Saul is not referred to as a king, but rather as a leader or commander. However, Saul is said to be made of king at Gilgal. Even David, before he was anointed king, was referred to only as a future Najid, or military commander. Various authors have attempted to harmonize the two narratives regarding Saul's death. Josephus writes that Saul's attempted suicide was stalled because he was not able to run the sword through himself, and that he therefore asked the Amalekite to finish it. Later biblical criticism has posited that the story of Saul's death was redacted from various sources, although this view in turn has been criticized because it does not explain why the contradiction was left in by the redactors. But since 2 Samuel records only the Amalekite's report, and not the report of any other eyewitness, some scholars theorize that the Amalekite may have been lying to try to gain favor with David. On this view, 1 Samuel records what actually happened, while 2 Samuel records what the Amalekite claims happened.